You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode.
I could have got more out. I could have got more. I don't know if I just... I could have got more.
Oscar, there are 1,100 people who are alive because of you. Look at them.
If I'd made more money. I threw away so much money. You have no idea. If I just...
There will be generations because of what you did.
I didn't do enough.
You did so much.
That heartbreaking scene is from Steven Spielberg's iconic Schindler's List. And I did not bother to say spoiler alert for this because the movie's over 30 years old by this point. So if you have not seen it, highly recommend just stop listening to the podcast and go watch the movie and then come back and listen to this episode. It is not an easy watch of a movie, but it's well worth the time. This particular clip that we just played here is toward the end of the movie, where Oskar Schindler has just saved the lives of roughly 1,200 Jewish people from dying in the Holocaust, and he stands surrounded by the workers that he rescued. And in the movie, they give him a ring inscribed with a line from the Talmud, "Whoever saves one life saves the world entire." And Schindler, played by Liam Neeson, is this flawed, complicated man who manipulated the Nazi system from within, and he just collapses in anguish. And he starts crying out, "I could have got more. I could have gotten more. I don't know, I could have gotten more." His accountant, Yitzhak Stern, tries to comfort him and reminds him of the lives that he saved, and he just can't stop. He looks at his car next and says, "Why did I keep the car? That could have been 10 people. I could have sold the car and bought 10 more people to work here at the factory to protect them. 10 more people." And he does that with the little Nazi pin that he had on his lapel. He says, "It's gold. I could have gotten 2 more people for this." And through this very moving scene, the movie asks the question, what does it mean to do enough? A while back, I did a social media video on the Star Trek exchange between Kirk and Spock about the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few, or vice versa. You have to watch the video to find out my thoughts on it. And one viewer, going by the handle AlexFrog1, connected that scene from the Star Trek movies to this scene from Schindler's List. And it got me thinking that we could do a short video on the topic. But while I was familiar with the scene, I really just wanted to sit down, watch the movie with this whole concept in my head and see what I could come up with. So recently, I sat down, watched the movie, and in all honesty, I got stuck. Because this scene from Schindler's List, the "Did I Do Enough?", it really opens up questions that don't have clean answers. The more I started to think about it, the more I couldn't get a clear answer to whether or not Schindler did enough. And beyond that, can anyone really do enough? What does that even mean? And what does that Talmudic principle of whoever saves one life saves the world entire actually mean when you dig into its original context? Well, the more I dug, the more complicated things got, because that always seems to be the way it is when I study something. I can't ever keep something simple, can I? So what was originally supposed to just be a short social media video is actually becoming a full-on podcast episode, because this topic just kept taking me further and further down the rabbit hole, and I felt like it was just something that I needed to share more in depth to give it the amount of time that actually deserved. So today we are going deep. We are going to explore a little bit of the life of Oskar Schindler, the historicity of this famous scene, the complicated rabbinical text that inspired the ring inscription, the philosophical tension between effectiveness and purity, and ultimately what Star Trek, Schindler's List, and a German theologian can teach us about what it means to do enough in a world saturated with evil. Alex Frog 1, this one's for you. This is the paradox of doing enough. Before we get into the theology and philosophy I want to talk through today, we need to understand a little bit of who Oskar Schindler actually was, because he is not who you might expect when you think of a Holocaust hero, if you are not familiar with the movie. The movie is based on a true story. Oskar Schindler was born in 1908 in what is now considered to be the Czech Republic. He was a German, a member of the Nazi Party from 1939, and quite the opportunist. When Germany invaded Poland, Schindler saw a chance to make money. So he acquired an enamelware factory in Krakow, staffed it with Jewish workers because they were cheaper than Polish labor at the time, and set about profiting from the war. So to be clear, at the start, Schindler was not motivated by altruism. He was not originally trying to save any Jews. He was just a war profiteer, a black marketer, an adulterer who was estranged from his wife, and he lived very lavishly. He spent extravagantly and cultivated relationships with SS officers through bribes, parties, and alcohol. But something did change as the war went on. And historians debate exactly when and why, but most would agree that it's just kind of this gradual change over time. Around 1943, Schindler started using his factory as a sanctuary. He began bribing officials, falsifying documents, claiming his Jewish workers were quote-unquote essential to the war effort when they weren't. Some were even in such bad health that they couldn't work. But he spent pretty much his entire fortune protecting these workers. And as other camps were being liquidated and workers being sent to Auschwitz, Schindler started to convince authorities to let him relocate these people to his factory in Czechoslovakia. And he drew up a list, the famous Schindler's List, of roughly 1,200 Jews that he claimed to need as workers. It was an inverted death sentence. To be on Schindler's List meant survival. But by war's end, Schindler was broke. The Schindlerjuden, the Schindler's Jews, had survived, but he himself was now wanted as a Nazi Party member. And he fled to Argentina, attempting several failed business ventures, and eventually returned to Germany, where he lived in relative poverty. In fact, he was supported for the rest of his life by donations from the Jewish survivors that he had saved. And he died in 1974, and was buried in Jerusalem, the only Nazi Party member to be honored at the Mount Zion Catholic Cemetery. So the tension of his life is that he was simultaneously a Nazi Party member who never gave up that affiliation, a war profiteer who exploited essentially slave labor for personal gain, and a man who bankrupted himself, ruining his marriage, but also saved 1,200 human beings from extermination. How do we evaluate the morality of such a person? That is the question that the movie asks. Now, let's talk for a minute about the famous scene from the end of the movie that we played the clip from at the start, where Schindler breaks down. Did it actually happen? The short answer is we don't actually know for certain. The scene comes from Thomas Keneally's 1982 novel Schindler's Ark, which is also sometimes called Schindler's List. And it was based on extensive interviews with the Schindlerjuden, the surviving Jews from his factory. Spielberg then adapted that in '93 with the movie by the same name. So the timeline we have here is the actual events back in the 40s, going to survivor testimonies from the 70s and early 80s, leading to a novelistic interpretation in the early 80s, and then a cinematic dramatization in the early 90s, each layer adding artistic license. So historians tend to be skeptical of some of these details. Schindler's departure was hurried. He was fleeing potential arrest as a war criminal. Would there have even been time for such an extended emotional breakdown? We do know he was given a ring by his workers, and whether or not it had that Talmudic inscription is actually debated as well. Many will say yes, but there are some who doubt that anyone would have had the skills and tools to be able to inscribe the inside of the ring there. So a lot of the details are lost to time, like the lamenting over the car and the pin and all of the specific dialogue from the iconic scene. We don't really know for sure if that ever happened. But does it really matter if that particular scene is historically precise? Schindler's List is not a documentary, it is a dramatization. And I would argue that the scene is emotionally and theologically true, even if we can't factually verify every word. Because here is what we do know: Schindler spent everything he had. He could have stopped earlier and kept some of his wealth, even just enough to live modestly after the war. But he didn't. And according to multiple survivor accounts, he really struggled deeply with the fact that more people died than he saved. Regardless of the historicity of exact details, the scene really works because it captures something very real about moral action: the gap between what we do and what we could have done, and how haunting that gap can be, especially when lives are at stake. Now we need to talk specifically about the ring inscription. Whoever saves one life saves the world entire. Schindler's accountant, Stern, tells him the quote comes from the Talmud. And if you're not familiar, the Talmud is a Jewish literary work, a very extensive literary work, that is partially translation and a whole lot of commentary on Jewish sacred texts. And it is just this collection of rabbis verbally duking it out over how to interpret particular passages. There's really no way you can explain what it is in a few sentences without majorly oversimplifying. It is a fascinating, fascinating series of documents and well worth study, even if you are not Jewish in ethnicity or religious belief. There's a tremendous amount you can learn from it. And one of the biggest things that I've taken away from it is just the way that these religious leaders of this faith are able to debate and still treat each other with a measure of respect. Not always, depending on which portion you're reading. Sometimes they're more respectful than others. But if nothing else, you're able to see how people from the Jewish faith have put these differing opinions side by side to show that there's not necessarily one right view of a particular passage or belief, but to show that there's conversation, there's dialogue. And that's something that, honestly, I'm kind of envious of as a Christian. I wish we had more of that in Christianity, where we could respectfully dialogue and disagree and still find ourselves on the same page of belief. Yeah, we could put our disagreements side by side and say both of these are Christian views. It's a great example of how to use Scripture as a conversation starter instead of a conversation ender. Anyway, mini rant over. So, going back to this particular quote from Schindler's List, whoever saves one life saves the world entire. It does kind of come from the Talmud, specifically Mishnah Sanhedrin 37a. It's a section about legal proceedings, particularly a witness's testimony in capital legal cases. And when you read it in that context, it's actually not about heroic rescue at all, at least not directly. I want to read to you a translation of this passage. Therefore, Adam, the first man, was created alone, to teach you that with regard to anyone who destroys one soul from the Jewish people, the verse ascribes him blame as if he destroyed an entire world. And conversely, anyone who sustains one soul from the Jewish people, the verse ascribes him credit as if he sustained an entire world. See, the context is crucial here. The rabbis are instructing witnesses in murder trials: tell the truth, because a false witness who causes an innocent person to be executed has, in effect, destroyed an entire world. Whatever would have come of the rest of that person's life is now gone for good. That is an alternate reality, an alternate timeline. It no longer has the potential to exist. So this is not primarily about going out and saving people. It is about the cosmic weight of truthfulness in legal proceedings. If we look at the 11th passage here, it sets this up, reading, "The laws of wealth are not the same as the laws of souls. The laws of wealth, a person gives wealth and is forgiven. The laws of souls, his blood and the blood of his descendants will be with him until the end of the world." The point? You can repay stolen money, but you cannot undo a judicial murder. The witness must understand that their testimony doesn't just affect one person. It affects everyone who would have descended from that person, everyone whose life would have been touched by them. One life contains multitudes. One life is a world. Now, there is a textual complication here. Some versions of the Talmud will say one soul from the Jewish people. Others just say one soul or even one soul from humanity. So the famous line being, whoever saves one soul saves the world entire, or whoever saves one life saves the world entire. Many scholars will suggest that the original read one soul from the Jewish people. Whoever saves one life from the Jewish people saves the world entire. Today, the universalist reading of any human life, or just one soul, one life, that is much more popular, and it is the version that is usually quoted. But historically, it makes more sense that this would have just referred to Jewish people because that's what it was about. It was specifically Jewish legal responsibility toward other Jews. So it's quite possible that the original meaning of this text from the Talmud was not about the immense good that any person can do by helping another person, but rather very specifically about the responsibility that one Jewish person had to another Jewish person to tell the truth in a legal proceeding. That being said, does this then narrow the application in Schindler's List? I would say no, because there is a pattern in rabbinic literature of taking legal principles and expanding them into ethical imperatives. If we look at the third Talmudic tractate in the order Netzikin, Bava Batra, and I apologize to anyone who speaks Hebrew better than I do. My New Jersey accent comes out in my Hebrew. This is Bava Batra 11a, and it reads, Binyamin, that's the Hebrew form of Benjamin, Benjamin the righteous was appointed supervisor over the charity fund. Once a woman came before him during the years of drought and said, My master, sustain me. He said to her, I swear by the temple service that there is nothing left in the charity fund. She says to him, My master, if you do not sustain me, a woman and her 7 sons will die. He arose and sustained her with his own funds. And then after some time, Benjamin fell deathly ill. The ministering angel said to the Holy One, blessed be he, Master of the universe, you said that anyone who preserves a single life in Israel is regarded as if he had preserved an entire world. Should then Benjamin the righteous, who saved a woman and her 7 sons, die after these few years? And they immediately tore up his sentence. And a later sage taught that they added 22 years to Benjamin's life. And notice what happened here. The legal principle from Sanhedrin, a witness about legal testimony, gets applied to someone's giving of charity. This Binyamin character saves lives, not by testifying truthfully in court, but by giving of his own money when the charity fund ran out. So the rabbis took this principle of one life equaling a whole world and expanded its application. This is very much how Talmudic ethics works, taking a legal teaching and asking, what does this reveal about the nature of human value? And the answer is, each person is irreplaceable, cosmically significant, really a whole world unto themselves. So when this text is applied to Schindler's life, it's not misusing it. Rather, it is an extension of what rabbis historically have done themselves, taking a principle about the infinite value of human life and applying it to someone who had saved lives. But here's the paradox we need to get into now. If saving one life is saving a whole world, then Schindler saved the world almost 1,200 times over. And by that logic, he infinitely did more than enough. I mean, 1,200 worlds. You would have to read a lot of Avengers comics before they saved 1,200 worlds. Yet Schindler still weeps. This is where we start to see the philosophical tension at the heart of our conversation today. Schindler is living between 2 moral frameworks simultaneously. First is utilitarian arithmetic. More saved equals more good. By this measure, 1,200 lives, while extraordinary, can never be enough because there could always be more. But then also, the second framework being the infinite value of the individual. Each person is a world of possibility in and of themselves, irreducibly valuable. So on the one hand, you have 10 worlds too few by not selling the car, 2 worlds too few by not selling the pin. While on the other hand, you have 1,200 worlds entirely. That is unbelievably impactful. This Talmudic principle of whoever saves one life saves the world entire is both comforting but also challenging. It elevates our understanding of what is at stake every single time a human life hangs in the balance. It really creates a paradox of infinite obligation. If each person is infinitely valuable, and there are always more people that you could help, then you are always infinitely in debt. There is no enough, because enough would require saving everyone, and you can't save everyone. That's the tension that this film captures so brilliantly. Stern tries to comfort Schindler with a focus on the individual. Look at them, 1,200 people, 1,200 individuals, 1,200 worlds. But Schindler can't accept it. He is haunted by the utilitarian gap between what he did and what he could have done, how many more lives he could have saved. And this is where I think philosophy and theology start to blend, because we can ask, is that haunting a sign of moral failure or moral maturity? On the one hand, you could certainly say that Schindler's tears are appropriate because they reflect a proper understanding of all that was lost in the years of the war. If he walked away satisfied, just wiping off his hands and saying, well, I did my part, that could suggest that he viewed those he couldn't save as expendable, as acceptable collateral losses. But his anguish reveals that he actually understood this Talmudic principle at heart. If each person is a world, then countless worlds were lost. But on the other hand, some might argue that Schindler's breakdown is inappropriate guilt, because he did all that he could given his circumstances. Sure, maybe he could have sold more and spent less, but his extravagant lifestyle was part of what helped him maintain the ruse that allowed him to save so many people in the first place. And to torment himself further is just to hold himself to an impossible standard. I'm not sure that the film gives a clear-cut answer on this matter. I'm sure there are very skilled film critics out there that could argue with me on this to no end, but I do think the film leans toward the idea that what Schindler did was maybe not enough, but enough in his circumstances. It was satisfactory. It was significant. It certainly does not seem to condemn him. It shows us a man confronting the impossible gap between his finite human capacity and infinite moral demand. He did what he could given who he was, a flawed man with resources and connections, but also vices and limitations. So in a way, he does rightly grieve what he didn't do. But in another way, what more could he have done? I can imagine some of you listening right now who prefer a clean-cut answer to life are probably pulling your hair out at me going, well, what's the answer here, Colin? What's right? And I think that's kind of the point. It's just the wrestling, the tension, the dissonance, not having a clear answer. And believe me, I'm not saying I like having no clear-cut answers, but that is the way life is a lot of times. It's not so black and white. It's often quite gray. And so I want to both muddy and hopefully clear up the waters here a little bit by introducing another character to this story. Now, this character shows up nowhere in Schindler's List. He is not a part of that story, but he is a real-life historical person who was a contemporary of Schindler. And I think that putting their lives in comparison to each other in parallel will give us a lot to think about and maybe help us come to a better resolution in determining if Schindler did enough. So in this next segment, I want to introduce you to a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German Lutheran pastor and theologian, born in 1906, just 2 years before Schindler. But their responses to Nazi evil couldn't have been much more different than they were. Bonhoeffer is a very complicated character. He started off as somewhat of a Christian nationalist in Germany, But Hitler's rise to power changed that. Bonhoeffer became involved in the Confessing Church, which resisted Nazi control of German Protestantism. He was very much against the marrying of politics and religion that was seen at that time and can really be seen here in America today. He knew from looking at history that bad things happen when religion and politics get in bed together. And it was his time here in America in the 30s that really changed him theologically. He could have stayed here in safety as the war was escalating, but he chose to return to Germany, famously saying, "I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people." So with great mental and spiritual anguish, Bonhoeffer joined the resistance. And he is probably most well known today for his part in a failed plot to assassinate Hitler. Though his exact role in that is debated, he was likely more of just a messenger in the process. Regardless, he was involved in trying to resist the Nazi Party. And in the same year that Schindler was bribing officials to save his workers, Bonhoeffer was arrested for his role in helping Jews escape to Switzerland and for his connections to the resistance. He was imprisoned for a couple years, and during that time he wrote some profound theological reflections on suffering, resistance, faithfulness, and much more. And on April 9th, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, Bonhoeffer was executed by hanging at the Flossenburg concentration camp. He was only 39 years old, and he saved far fewer people than Oskar Schindler ever did. Estimates vary, but he may have helped few dozen Jews escape. He died really young, and he left behind a lot of unfinished work. By utilitarian measures, Bonhoeffer was far less successful than Schindler, and he was no pure saint either. He remained haunted the rest of his life over his role in the plot to assassinate Hitler. He saw it as a sin that he was willing to commit in order to serve the greater good. And yet he was nowhere near as complicit with the system as Schindler was. At least he stood outside of it and tried to draw clear lines between right and wrong. Bonhoeffer was willing to resist openly and accept the consequences. Schindler, on the other hand, chose efficacy within corruption. He remained a Nazi Party member his whole life. He got drunk with SS officers. He played the game. He exploited the system from within. And yet that complicity was also the mechanism of salvation for over 1,000 people. So here's the agonizing question. Which choice was right? Theologically speaking, Bonhoeffer's ethics were deeply Christological. Christ didn't manipulate the Roman system from within to save more people. He spoke out against the abuses of Rome and accepted that crucifixion would be the fate of anyone who did. Bonhoeffer believed that some moral lines cannot be crossed, even for good outcomes. To remain within the Nazi Party, even as a double agent, is to participate in evil. The integrity of your witness matters. Now again, he still got his hands very dirty, but he refused to be complicit. At least he was fighting fire with fire, not adding more fuel to the flames. Bonhoeffer also believed in participatory suffering, that standing in solidarity with the victims, sharing their fate, is a form of moral witness that matters beyond measurable outcomes. His death in a concentration camp meant that he suffered alongside those he was trying to save, in ways that Schindler never did. On the other hand, Schindler atoned for his own sins with 30 years of misery and failure after the war. And we have to ask the question, does moral contamination negate moral action? If you save lives through evil means, like bribery, blackmail, maintaining membership in a genocidal party, have you saved those lives righteously? Or have you just created a different kind of moral disaster? Does that even matter, since at the end of the day, lives were still saved? To make the case for Schindler, 1,200 human beings walked out of the war alive who otherwise would have gone to horrible deaths because Schindler stayed inside the system. Had he tried to do what Bonhoeffer did, he probably would have saved about as many people as Bonhoeffer did. So ask those survivors if his approach was wrong. Ask their children, their grandchildren. There are thousands of people alive today, thousands of worlds, because Schindler made compromises that Bonhoeffer likely would not have made. And he used his vices effectively. His drinking, his womanizing, his extravagance made him seem like one of them to the SS officers. His flaws were paradoxically part of his effectiveness. And here's a hard truth. Bonhoeffer's martyrdom is often seen as this beautiful theological statement, but it didn't stop the Holocaust. The assassination plots failed. His death, while meaningful, can kind of be seen as a strategic failure. But maybe this is all a false binary, pitting one against the other. Because Schindler and Bonhoeffer faced different circumstances and had different capacities. Bonhoeffer was a pastor and theologian. His tools were words, witness, and moral clarity. Schindler was a businessman with Nazi connections. His tools were money, manipulation, and insider status. And really, Bonhoeffer got the picture earlier than Schindler did, and arguably for morally better reasons. Schindler came about this very much through pragmatic means. I don't think that makes his results any less important, but these two men were already on very different paths, and well entrenched in those paths when they came face to face with the moral dilemmas that they had to make decisions on. So perhaps the question isn't who chose the right method, but rather, are both kinds of resistance necessary? Bonhoeffer's witness kept alive the moral clarity that the Nazi system was evil. Period. Not going to join up with it. Without people like Bonhoeffer, there's a danger that compromisers like Schindler could begin to rationalize evil. I'm doing good within the system, so the system can't be all bad, right? But Schindler's pragmatism saved actual lives in real time. We're not just talking numbers on paper, we're talking about actual human lives. And without people willing to get their hands dirty, the Bonhoeffers of the world are prophetic voices crying in the wilderness while people die. Maybe the tragedy is that both are actually needed, and both pay a terrible price just in different currency. Bonhoeffer paid with his life and his unfinished work. Schindler also paid with his life, but in a very different way that he had to still live out. And in a way, both paid with their souls, compromising themselves, living with their own moral contamination, and carrying the haunting knowledge of everyone they weren't able to save. Let's bring that Talmudic principle back into play. The rabbis said, destroy one life, destroy a world. Save one life, save a world. And that cuts both ways for Schindler. He double-dipped. He saved 1,200 worlds. Extraordinary. But he was also a Nazi party member, complicit in a system that murdered roughly 6 million Jews, let alone all the other casualties of the war. He ran a factory that initially exploited Jewish slave labor for profit. He benefited from the theft of Jewish property. How many worlds did he help to destroy before he started saving them? Probably over 1,200. And that's the theological horror of the Holocaust. It didn't just kill individuals. According to Talmudic logic, it destroyed worlds, potentials, timelines. And everyone who was complicit, even those who later tried to resist, had a hand in participating in that destruction. Schindler couldn't undo his complicity. He could and did work against it. He can save worlds, but the worlds lost because of the system he joined never get to come back. And that's why I think the breakdown he has at the end of the movie is so important. He's not just mourning the people he didn't save, he is confronted with the full moral weight of what he was a part of. And maybe that's what doing enough looks like in a world saturated with structural evil. You do what you can to resist, knowing it will never be enough to undo the evil that you are embedded in. You can save who you can save, and you appropriately mourn those who you can't. All right, let's bring this back to where we started. Star Trek. In The Wrath of Khan, Spock sacrifices himself to save the Enterprise crew, saying that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Classic utilitarianism. Very logical. Maximize the good for the greatest number. But in The Search for Spock, Kirk risks everything. His career, his ship, his crew, to bring Spock back. And when Spock asks why, Kirk responds, because the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many. On the surface, this seems like a contradiction in their positions, but really both statements can be true in their own contexts. Spock's sacrifice is heroic because it's voluntary. He's not saying we should sacrifice someone else for everyone else. He's not trying to throw a red shirt out to save the crew. He's saying, I will sacrifice myself for you. That's not just calculation. Dare I say, for a Vulcan, that's also love. On the other side of the coin, Kirk's rescue mission is heroic because it honors particular relationships and obligations. Spock isn't just a utilitarian unit in Kirk's calculus. He's Spock. That relationship has moral weight beyond abstract numbers. What Schindler's List adds to this conversation is complexity. Because Schindler isn't choosing between saving many or saving few. He is trying to save as many as possible within the constraints of an evil system that he is embedded in. The needs of the many would suggest maximize lives saved. And I think you can make the argument that Schindler did that. He kept trying to bring more and more people in. And eventually you just reach a wall of what you are physically able to do. That doesn't mean we can't mourn what never was. But the needs of the few, as Kirk would argue, would suggest that if each person matters infinitely, we can and should mourn the loss of worlds, but not at the expense of celebrating the ones that survived. We do not honor the dead by dishonoring the living. Earlier this year, I wrote a blog post on our website. I don't get to do that often. I've written about one a year so far. I was hoping to do more, but, life gets in the way. But this one that I wrote, I called The Exhaustion of Eternal Consequence. And I believe the subtitle was something like, Why Over-Spiritualizing Life Kills Spirituality. The general idea of it was that in the circles that I grew up in, everything had a spiritual meaning. Everything mattered for eternity. Everything had to be run through the filter of what spiritual eternal good does this do? And I believe that came from, initially, a good heart of wanting to focus on things just beyond this life, wanting to focus on the long term and trying to better people spiritually. All for that. Not a problem. But over time, it became less about that and more about worrying, more about constantly stressing over whether or not what you were doing was enough. I don't think a lot of pastors realize that when they are constantly driving their congregation to do more for God, to pass out more tracts, invite more people to church, give more to the church, spend more time going on outreaches and missions trips and church building projects and doing all of these things, that they are actually creating anxiety in the minds of some of their congregants. Now, this is certainly not true for everyone, but there is a significant segment of us who spent time in evangelicalism and fundamentalism who heard those messages, and what we took away from it was you're never doing enough. And so, we all have different ways that our brains are wired, different ways that we think. And so for some of us, what we actually took away was not a healthy sense of responsibility and awareness of meaning beyond this mortal plane. What we took away was scrupulosity, which is a fancy way of saying religious OCD, anxiety around doing enough for God. And I was really dealing with this personally around late high school, early college. And I know this is going to sound ridiculous to some of you, but believe me, I am not the only one. I've heard the stories from other people. This is actually a lot more common than you would think in evangelical and fundamental circles, where you start to wonder, okay, if it's good that I go to church on Sunday, it's better if I go to church on Sunday and also Wednesday night prayer meeting. And if that's better, then it's best if I also go when we have a missions conference or an evangelism conference or, some other special event at church. If it's good for me to invite someone to church, it's better for me to spend 2 hours on my weekend and specifically go out knocking on doors and inviting people to church. And if that's better, then wouldn't it be best to actually take an entire weekend and do nothing else And if that's better, why don't I take all of my free time and do that? And really, when you start to think about this logically with this very utilitarian system of good, better, best, you never actually reach best. It's constantly a sliding scale. Good becomes no longer good once you get better. Then it becomes bad. We lose this idea that good is still good. Inviting one person, giving to one cause, attending one service, that's good. But in our minds, that stopped being good as soon as we started doing more. Then what used to be good was now bad, and we had to keep going more and more. And what we didn't realize is that every time we were moving the goalposts further and further away, so we could never do enough. A lot of churches will encourage you to give 10% a tithe of your money to the church, and that's considered good. But in the church that I grew up in, that wasn't good enough. See, we were told that was the baseline to be okay in God's sight. You also needed to give on top of that, and whatever that could be, maybe another 5, 10%, whatever. So that's what's actually better. But as soon as you start doing that better, now that's just the good baseline. You can't ever move backwards and still be good. You can only give more. And so if 10% is good, 20 is better. 30 is even better than that. And well, then why can't I just get to a point where I'm giving everything? And you get to such a point where you can't feasibly live anymore. Or on an even more ridiculous note, but again, I actually personally felt this in my own life. If it is good to seek God's will in your life, why not keep moving that into smaller and smaller areas of your life? If I should be praying for God's wisdom in what college I go to, or what job I take, or what person I date, maybe I should also be asking for God's wisdom in what car I purchase, or where I decide to go hang out on Saturday, or even what outfit I wear today. I told you, some of you are going to think that's absolutely ludicrous. That is scrupulosity. And there are a lot of Christians out there who deal with that because they have been taught this utilitarian mindset, this exhaustion of eternal consequence. When everything matters for eternity, nothing does. It's never good enough. And honestly, the only way that I started to break out of that system of thinking was to realize how much the Bible emphasized rest, how God himself rested after creation, how he frequently commanded his people to put in rest periods in their calendar, how Jesus took time to rest, how he calls us to find rest in him. If you have this mindset of good, better, best utilitarianism where you constantly have to be doing more and more and more for God, you're never able to rest. And that's not healthy because you burn yourself out. And then you're actually no good at all because you can't do anything. It's a very American mindset to constantly wonder if you have done enough. And the Bible ain't an American book. It's ancient. It's Near Eastern. It comes from a culture that understood life is not linear. It's not a capitalistic game where you have to come out on top. It's cyclical. It has seasons. It has periods where you need to pause. What's the trite overused phrase? We're not human doings, we're human beings. God didn't make us machines. He made us people. And people can't do everything. Last time I checked, there's only one savior for the world. And his name's not Colin. Nor is it yours. We are responsible for what is right in front of us. We are not responsible for everyone, or everything. It is good to have a heart for people in need. And honestly, I think many of us as Americans could stand to go a little further down that road, have a little more care for the people around us. But by the same token, you can go absolutely insane feeling the pain of people half a world away, watching the news or listening to some missionary that comes into church and tells you about this people group and that people group, and when all we have is what's right in front of us. We are neither all powerful nor are we all present. And more importantly, we're not the only people to exist. There are billions of people on this planet doing good. We're not the only ones. God can work through anyone. He doesn't need you to save the world. He just needs you to see the world that is right in front of you. and the people he has placed in your life. I spent a couple weeks mulling over this question of whether or not Schindler did enough. It really stumped me for a while. I could not figure out which side of the argument I wanted to land on. Until finally I decided that was actually the wrong question to be asking. And I realized that by coming back to the Star Trek scene. Because we get two different perspectives, depending on which of the movies we're watching. If Spock had prioritized the needs of the few, the whole crew probably would have died. If Kirk had prioritized the needs of the many, Spock would have been lost. If Schindler had run about trying to rescue even more people than he did, he may have put the ones that were in his own care at risk. So if enough means exhausting every possible resource out there and living out every possibility, then sure, none of us are ever going to do enough. Every time you choose to do one thing, you are saying no to 1,000 other things. That really bothers people like me. I have this pathological need to experience everything. Like, hopefully this example doesn't cheapen what I'm talking about here, but it at least helps you to understand me a little bit better. I didn't really get to go to concerts growing up in fundamentalism, so I've been doing that a lot more in the past several years, listening to bands that I really enjoy. And it's easy for me to be so focused on collecting these experiences of going and seeing every band that I possibly want to see ever, that I actually miss out on enjoying the one that I'm seeing right now. Or I'm so focused on the next place that we have to go later this week that I'm not enjoying the moment that I'm in right now with the people that I'm with. That's why our Ecclesiastes series was so meaningful to me, because the author, Kohelet, he speaks of these experiences that he had, how he tried everything, did everything, and yet still didn't find it satisfying, because what really matters is what is right in front of you. I think that realization brings this conversation out of just movie fan nerdiness and into real life. Because it's easy for us to play the what if game. What if I had chosen that different career path? What if I hadn't said that thing? What if, what if, what if? We love that question so much that we actually have an animated TV show about fictional characters in the Marvel Universe asking what if their timeline happened differently. The timeline never happened to begin with. It's all fiction. And yet we are still asking what if questions for alternatives. We are not even satisfied to ask all the what ifs of our own lives. We have to ask them of fictional characters. We're never satisfied. We never have enough. And I realize that when we're talking about Schindler's Case, we are talking about human lives. That's different than concerts or job choices or the stories of fictional characters, for sure. But if a firefighter saves one life from a burning building on one side of town, do we fault them for not being on the opposite side of town to stop a different fire where somebody else died? No, of course not. We praise them for the life that they saved. Why? Because that's all they can do. And there are other people who can do other jobs, take care of other needs. I'm not saying we shouldn't care about other people, but sometimes, especially in Christianity, I see people agonizing over souls in some country half a world away, and yet they can't even be bothered to take care of the homeless and needy in their own town. We're missing the point. I hate to be a cynic, but sometimes it feels like we're more concerned about how many missionaries we can say we're supporting, or how many people we saw saved through some evangelism trip that we went on, rather than actually taking care of the needs that are right in front of us. And maybe it's because they're not as measurable. It's not as sexy to be able to say that somebody from the church gave a meal to somebody in need without having it as a church program that people get to flash up on the screen at the end of the year and say, we did X number of things. But that's where life is lived. I might not agree with all of Schindler's choices, and certainly not with his politics, but I understand the pull to stay within the system, broken as it is. And we have the benefit of hindsight to look back almost 100 years later and say, oh, the Nazi Party was clearly evil. But sometimes when you're in the thick of it, and this is all you've known and you've already dedicated your whole life to something, it feels better to stay inside and try to change a broken system from within than to give it all up and start over. And look at Bonhoeffer. Look at what happened when he gave it all up, when he tried to go in from the outside. And this is something I see a lot in the deconstruction community, if I can kind of spiritualize this a little bit. As people who come from fundamentalist and evangelical circles start to question their beliefs and assumptions and realize that maybe things aren't quite as black and white and certain as they have been led to believe, they are often faced with this choice of, do I stay or do I go? Because unfortunately, even though Christianity is inherently about curiosity and learning and sharing, that's not what modern American Christianity is about. It's become about certainty and exclusion, and so they don't welcome people who don't believe exactly like they do. I felt this tension so strongly about 5 years ago as I was going through my own deconstruction and realizing that my own beliefs had shifted because of my studies of the Bible. And also realizing that if people knew that, I would no longer be accepted and welcome in circles that I had given 2 decades of my life to. And I really, really, really didn't want to leave. I knew there would be so much cost to it. I knew there would be shunning. I knew there would be whispering. I knew there would be rumors going around about me and why I chose to leave. And very few, if any, people would actually come talk to me about it, which unfortunately did prove to be true. So at first, I convinced myself that I could stay inside the broken system of fundamentalism and reform it from the inside out, be this modern-day Martin Luther of the independent fundamental Baptist movement. But the thing about reformers is they tend to die young, either as martyrs or because of poor health. And I saw myself moving quickly down that path. As someone who already struggled with a fair deal of depression, I knew that was not going to be a good decision. So I chose to leave the circles that mattered most to me, and to leave behind the people that meant the world to me, and to risk becoming an outcast to some of them because they weren't on the same path that I was and couldn't understand why I felt like I needed to leave. I was recently talking with a friend about part of this journey, and I described it as feeling like I was being traded from my favorite sports team. It wasn't something that I wanted to do. It was something that upper management decided for me. I gave my blood, sweat, tears, and years of my life to that cause. I wore that jersey. I cared so much about it. And then one day, the general manager steps in and says, "You're going to be traded to a different team." Now, as many of you know, I am a hardcore Philly sports fan, and we do not like most of the other teams. Don't care what sport it is. Just, if you're not in Philly, we probably don't like you. That sometimes goes for just people in general, too. It doesn't matter if somebody played for us for years and they were our star player. The second they're traded and they put on that other jersey and then they come back into Philly, we are booing the heck out of them. And I knew that was the way the church was going to be, too. And yet, I still have many friends who have remained inside those circles, doing their part to keep the lights on as the Titanic sinks. I do not condemn them for that. I have a freedom that I know many of them wish they could have. And they have a safety and a community that I wish I had. Who's right? That's the wrong question to ask. Different people, different circumstances, different times. It was right for me to stay for a while. I also firmly believe it was right for me to leave when I did. I know that whole bit may seem like a tangent, but trust me, it's not. Because it shows just how messy and complicated these questions and conversations are. Star Trek gave us a thought experiment in clean, controlled circumstances. Schindler's List gave us the messy reality of trying to do good within a system designed for evil. And sometimes the only way to save many is to compromise yourself. Sometimes you can't calculate your way to enough. Sometimes love means mourning the people you couldn't save at the same time you celebrate the people that you did. Maybe Bonhoeffer was right to separate himself and to take the path that he did. Maybe he could have done more had he taken a different path. Maybe Schindler was wrong for staying within such a corrupt political system. Or maybe that was the best way for him to take his own corrupt life and do something meaningful with it. Bonhoeffer chose prophetic witness. Schindler chose compromised effectiveness. And I think we needed both of them. Maybe moral heroism doesn't have just one shape. Maybe in this broken world, faithfulness looks different depending on where you're standing and what tools you have. Jesus frequently said more than his words alone conveyed. His teachings and parables were like the proverbial diamond that when you hold up to the light, you see the different facets of it. So too is the Talmudic principle that we have been discussing today. Whoever saves one life saves the world entire. On the one hand, that is a very challenging statement that drives us to see the cosmic significance of our decisions and of the people around us, and to do better and to do more. And yet, on the other hand, it encourages us to rest in what we have done and to not feel like we are constantly running on a treadmill that never ends, but to pause and reflect and celebrate even the little things because they matter infinitely. The lesson of Schindler's List is not do enough so you can stop feeling guilty, but rather love people as if each one were the whole world. Do what you can, and only what you can. If your only measurement of success is numbers, you will never do enough. You will never be enough. But people are more than numbers. I know this has been about Star Trek and Schindler's List, but the Star Wars nerd in me has to bring this out because I just thought of this, and there's this wonderful scene in the animated Clone Wars show that I grew up watching. I realize it's a cartoon, but it is not a kid's show. It is fantastic, and there's so much depth to it, and it centers on the lives of these clones who are all replicas of one person, and so they are often treated as if they are just essentially robots. They're not really human. They're not real people because they are just replicas. And yet the best characters saw the humanity in each of them. And there's this great scene, it's from the 3rd season, where there are a bunch of clones training to go out into the Clone Wars. And there was this one defective clone. He was number 99. He had some genetic mutation where he wasn't healthy enough to go out into battle, and he was treated as less than. He was the brunt of all of the jokes. And yet, some clones saw his humanity and treated him as a person, but regardless of how they treated him, he always treated them as more. And there's this one scene where one of the clones, who goes by the name Heavy, was getting ready to desert because he thought that he was being a burden to his squad and keeping them back, and 99 finds him as he's about to leave and tries to convince him to stay. And Heavy says, "We're just numbers, 99. We're just numbers." And 99 responds, "Not to me. To me, you always had a name." That's why I actually prefer the original title of Schindler's List. The novel's original title is Schindler's Ark. Schindler's List puts those people in terms of numbers. And it forces us to ask the question if he did enough, because there could always be more numbers on the ledger. But Schindler's Ark? That evokes imagery of Noah's Ark. Noah, he didn't save 1,200 people. There were only 8 on that ark. And yet, according to the biblical story, we're all here because of it. Did Noah do enough? Well, I mean, he probably could have gotten more people on. Maybe he could have been more evangelistic, if you will. Could have gotten better advertising, done better apologetics explaining why this was a necessity. And yet here we are today. When we read the story of Noah's Ark, we don't tend to consider how many more people he could have fit on that ark. We just celebrate the lives that were saved and the new life that came after it. The list isn't actually the most important part of the story. The ark is. The factory. The way that he saved those lives. Star Trek gave us the clean version, the on-paper arithmetic. Schindler's List gave us the real version. And somewhere between Spock's logic and Kirk's love, between Schindler's compromise and Bonhoeffer's witness, between the arithmetic of effectiveness and the infinite value of one life, that's where we all live today. That's where we try to see not numbers, but people, worlds. And that is enough. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.